And even though the Cold War ended, our relations with Russia improved dramatically. And I'm part of that. I saw them up close, worked with them, and they did great things for us, particularly when we went into Afghanistan initially. They were very helpful to us. I don't think we could have gone in and accomplished anything without the valuable intelligence that they put. But it didn't make any difference to the elites in Washington, who were interested in the same thing that they had been interested in the 1990s. And that was, how do we get at Russia? How do we strip it of its resources? How do we remove the current government and place something there instead that will do our bidding? Because that's effectively what we've managed to do wherever we've spent any time. We've managed to install leaders that were amenable to us, that would cooperate with us. And NATO itself, which was originally designed to be a purely defensive alliance, was transformed in the 1990s into this offensive instrument. And we dragged our European allies kicking and screaming in whatever direction we chose to move. And that was very obvious in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and then subsequently in Kosovo, subsequently in Afghanistan, and then Iraq, and ultimately even in Syria, and finally Libya. So all of these places have been subject to this enormous pressure that comes from the United States through NATO. And part of that is because, obviously, Europeans have almost no military power. They've largely dismantled their own capability, become entirely dependent upon us. When I was at Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe, one of the things that became very clear was that everything relating to command, control, computers, communications, electronics, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, all the space-based, sea-based assets, everything was American. And European forces, even if they decided collectively, well, we don't want the Americans here and we're all going to cooperate, had nothing with which to command, control, and operate their own forces. So this put the Europeans in a difficult position because clearly the European elites were not interested in spending any money on their own defense. And so they couldn't possibly turn around to their populations with these very expensive and luxurious welfare systems with declining workforces that only work 8 hours or not even 8 hours a day or only 6 hours a day or only 30 hours a week and so forth. How do you turn to those electorates and say, well, I'm sorry, we're going to have to cut back on all these luxurious vacation times, all these holidays, and we're going to have to build up our own military capability because it's going to take, at least billions and billions, hundreds of billions of dollars in order for us to have the constellations in space, the command and control structure in order to operate on our own. Nobody wanted to do it. So they decided, well, we'll just go along with Americans and we'll try to limit the damage that we do to ourselves or that the Americans end up doing to us. Well, this is no longer possible. You can't limit it because the United States has dragged Europe right into the combat zone in Ukraine and made it very clear that we expect Europeans to support this war in Ukraine to the last Ukrainian. In fact, behind the scenes, I think there's been a great deal of pressure to try and get Europeans to provide troops, provide air forces, provide navies to also fight against the Russians on the conventional level. I don't think that's been very successful, but no doubt it has happened. So this brings us to the point where we are now. And Ukraine is about finished. There's not much left. I don't think they have much manpower left. Their press gangs are operating in the far west, trying to drag Ukrainians in the far west and Hungarians that live on Ukrainian soil, for instance, into the Ukrainian army. Obviously, there's not much enthusiasm. At least 12 million people have left Ukraine. Large numbers of single men are continuing to leave. There are trains in Germany every day carrying Ukrainian refugees, and there are huge numbers of single young men. And inside Ukraine itself, we now see that some of these press gangs trying to drag people into the Ukrainian army are being pelted with stones, in some cases even fired on. We also know that for the first time in great numbers, Ukrainian forces are seeing desertions. But most of these desertions are not simply individuals. They are platoons and companies. And most recently, a Ukrainian commander who had a company and a very, very badly wounded group of people in the company made direct contact with the Russians because he said he could not get the wounded evacuated. The Ukrainian military would not come and get them. And he said, either we sit here and die or we surrender. I've decided to surrender. And remember that most of the forces you're talking about are speaking Russian on both sides. And there isn't very much difference between them. And the Russians very intelligently have always treated Ukrainian soldiers very carefully with great respect. So the Ukrainians know they're not going to be harmed. And as a result, things are just continuing to accelerate in a downward spiral. And against this backdrop, we see all sorts of incredible threats and claims of success and victory coming out of